Welcome to First in Future. I'm Leslie Boney with the Institute for Emerging Issues at NC State University, and each week on this program we talk with someone in North Carolina who is looking forward, who is trying to imagine the future of our state and looking around the corner to determine what we need to do to get there and how we can best accomplish that. This week we're lucky to be joined by Secretary Larry Hall, who's Secretary of the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, a former Marine, a former state legislator, and the perfect person to have as we get into the July 4th week to think about our country and where our country's going in the future. Secretary Hall, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, and I do want to interject for all my Marine brethren out there that once a Marine, always a Marine, but once a legislator, former legislator.
So we'll call you a Marine and a former legislator. Okay, got it. You grew up in Durham, but then started moving almost immediately because you came from a military family.
Well, it was pretty exciting for my parents. Of course, I was 6 months old when we moved from Durham to Okinawa, Japan, and my father was on a company tour as an Army officer. So I guess you could say I started moving as soon as possible.
Went to Johnson C. Smith, graduated, went into the Marines, coming out of an Army family. Was that frustrating to your father?
Well, when we came back from Japan, we moved to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and I was an Army brat. But in the meantime, my older brother joined the Air Force when he graduated from UNC. So the die was cast that we would not all be Army. I had several cousins and others who did follow my father's lead and joined the Army, but after my brother joined the Air Force, I started looking around as well and thought the Marines were the challenge to be conquered and join the Marines.
Do you remember thinking about that? Was it a conscious decision, or did you know from the beginning that you were going to have a period of time in your life in the military?
Well, as I said, I grew up on Fort Bragg until the second grade anyway, so from kindergarten or from being 3 or 4 years old until about 7 years old, I was on Fort Bragg. And so a lot of values and a lot of images were put in my mind from seeing life on the military installation, seeing the parades, having the opportunity to see my father jump. He was in the 82nd. And so those were exciting times for a young kid. And seeing him jump at Sicily Drop Zone and all the activities that went around that, seeing the military parades and having life on post, I think it had a big impact, and I think it might have been that I was destined, based on that exposure, to be in the military, some branch, and I thought I was taking it to the next degree or next level by joining the Marines.
Your attachment was primarily to the Middle East, or spending time thinking about and working in the Middle East. What did you learn from that time that you find stays with you today, a few years later?
Well, yeah, and quite a few years later, but the need or the ability for us as a nation to look at policies and try to learn and project them on to new situations is important. I heard some folks talking the other day about the need to prepare for combat and be able to use that. And in the military, many times we detach ourselves from other policy and just say, if you go to war, if you start shooting, we will be ready, and limit to that. But we really have to look at what is the real cost of military engagement and what are the other options or levers of power we can use to achieve a long-standing purpose. And so one of the things I learned is in the Middle East and in other encounters we've had, we have not learned that lesson well and haven't applied it well. So we have a lot of growing to do and understanding. It's nice to talk, nice to threaten, nice to be the big kid on the block, but once you engage, then you have to think about sustainability, or you need to think about that in advance and then not lose sight of the real goal or purpose.
A few years ago, the military started putting a greater emphasis on a little bit about what you're talking about, a little bit more about military personnel who were both fully trained in traditional military behavior, but also were essentially diplomats who could have conversations with people and prevent bad things from happening. So thinking about moving a little bit more upstream to prevent the worst things that are going to happen downstream.
And when you think about Afghanistan in particular, that was one of the efforts that was made. And strangely enough, that also increased the involvement of women because they were not perceived as a threat and were able to communicate more with the tribes in the different provinces in Afghanistan. And one of the big things that happened there was it was necessary for military leaders in the local areas, Marines, Army, U.S. forces, even Allied forces, to make sure they were at the smaller village level, which harkens back sort of to Vietnam in many people's minds. Mm-hmm. But at the village level, they were communicating with who the very local leaders were, and they would then communicate to the province leaders. And that was, again, people became ambassadors at some of the lower levels and had to have the training you talked about, and that moved its way up the chain on the civilian side for the indigenous population and on the military side. So a lot was learned from that, but again, those lessons seem to be lost after the conflict's over, and we have to learn them again. Again, a lot of lessons from Vietnam were already learned in this area, and we've started to try to apply them, and hopefully we'll do better as we go forward.
One of the elements of the relative reorganization of the military over the past few years is that North Carolina has actually gotten a little bit stronger. Much of the consolidation seems to have flowed net positive to North Carolina, where a lot of places are losing troops. We've got what generally is described as the second or third largest military presence in North Carolina. What does that mean?
Well, it means a lot of things from the standpoint of, if you look at about approximately 120,000 uniformed personnel, if you look at 32,000 plus Reserve and National Guard, you have a tremendous size force that's interdependent. And the new strategy of the armed forces utilizes the Reserve and the National Guard on a frequent basis, much more than previously, and missions and responsibility have been transferred. So that is a big impact on the state. It also means that a lot of state opportunities are here for veterans and the military, and a lot of federal funding flows to this state. We anticipate or project that the military is the second largest industry in North Carolina behind agriculture. $66 billion a year in agriculture is more than twice that, but still the second largest. And again, part of that is because it's federal dollars coming in. So the more we're able to interact, the more funding we get from the federal level, which is important because North Carolina is a donor state. So not only is it good for our national defense, but also it's good for our state economic situation. That's important. We have a wealth of talent as a result also. And if we can keep that talent in North Carolina, that's a value add to North Carolina because they've been trained on federal dollars, and we're able to keep them in industry and the professions here in North Carolina. And then finally, we have such a tremendous veteran population in North Carolina. Many of the military want to retire to North Carolina because we take care of our veterans.
I was talking to a retired Green Beret last night and asked him about the transition back. And he mentioned some of the downsides, and I want to talk a little bit about that, some of the challenges you have with veterans who are reintegrating into the workforce. But he also said, if you think about what we are good at making quick decisions in the field, sometimes with limited evidence, at improvising, at working on teams, and you'd think that that would be an employee that a lot of people would be interested in.
Well, we have a lot of partnerships with the USO, with an organization called NC for Military Employment, with a lot of corporations around the state. What's important, and we tell them is, and I got this phrase from a master sergeant who was a double amputee who served in Afghanistan and was with his unit when he lost both of his legs. And even after he lost both of his legs, he was still concerned about the welfare of his unit. And all the time during recovery, he was thinking about that. But he said, our military are culture carriers. And if you understand the culture of the military, you cited some of the things that they get from training, but they also have discipline and respect and integrity and dedication. And those things are things that many organizations spend millions of dollars for training to try to implement those ideas into their workforce and into the people they collaborate with. So by bringing in military talent, you can change the culture because you have people who are living the actual principles you want to be displayed in your company.
Mm-hmm. He was saying perfect COO, sort of chief operating officer, or someone who you can give a general task to and they'll just figure out how to get it done.
That's right. And the level of training, again, is usually cutting edge for our government and military now, especially in areas of cybersecurity, drone implementation and usage, a lot of engineering fields regarding communications, and energy. And so the training is there, the cultural markers you want are there, and whatever level you have them in your company, they will boost the performance of your other employees. And I'll say this, I was at UNC 2 days ago at a physician's assistant program they started where they take Army medics and Marine corpsmen or Navy corpsmen and take them through a 2-year process and train them to be physician's assistants. Now that expands the medical services available in our state, which is something we need. We've got over 1 million citizens in North Carolina who don't have access to health care where they live. And by having those additional physician's assistants, they can have access to health care, and that helps all of us. A 2-year program that takes in consideration their training in the services, and that's just a model that can be across the board. UNC now has more veteran students who were members of the armed forces than they've ever had as a percentage of their population since World War II. That lets you know our Afghanistan and Iraq veterans are starting to show up in more numbers in our educational institutions and in society at large.
One of the challenges universities have is what generally goes under the term of credit for prior learning. So there was notoriously a few years ago people who were getting out of special forces who were going through school and then they were being told they couldn't graduate because they hadn't passed the physical ed requirement because they hadn't taken the course. What do you think we could do to improve the ability of institutions of higher ed to understand what people have learned in the military? Not just physical fitness, obviously, but history courses that they've taken, language proficiency that they've achieved, and yet sometimes they come in and people say, well, you still have to take our course, because our course is the one we trust.
Well, that's why the physician's assistant program was so important, because it did do that and acts as a model for people who are trying to do that. We've also had legislation passed recently to have those initiatives at the university level and community college level to determine what is the proper translation or credit to be given for both military experiences and military training. And so as we get better at that and we have more programs, and another program UNC Greensboro has for a nursing program that gives particular credit to the military toward their nursing certificate, and that gives them an advanced finish rate, or they complete the degree quicker and go into the workforce quicker. And then the local hospitals, et cetera, want these students, again, because they are culture carriers and they have that technical knowledge based on the certificate they've received or the degree they received. So we're making slow progress, not as fast as we should. Many of the corporations are understanding how to hire and read and understand military credits that they have for training and military schools. And so we're making slow progress there, but the initiative is there and we're building on it, and we have several successes to show.
There are a lot of stories, and there's at least some data that would seem to suggest that some folks transitioning out of the military struggle when they come back. I saw a poll recently that said 27% of transitioning military report some trouble transitioning to civilian life, and among post 9/11 people who'd served, it was closer to 40%. What can we do to make that transition easier?
The transition, and it's a significant challenge here in North Carolina, because you look at around 2,000 soldiers and Marines a month and airmen who transition from active duty to civilian life somewhere, somehow. And a initiative at Fort Bragg is called the Career Resource Center, where if people remember during the last 2 years of President Obama's administration, they created a policy that said if you're on active duty and you're on your initial enlistment, the last 6 months of your enlistment, you can get joint training if it's available and your command approves it before you transition out. That eases the transition process. It saves us a lot of money because those folks won't be drawing unemployment. They will be employed the day they come off active duty. The other part of the program is for career soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marine, and Coasties. They would have up to a year of that type training, and they would get counseled 2 years before their departure date to help them find a career path, and then to have that final year to get that training. And so that has paid big dividends for soldiers, sailors, Marines in North Carolina, airmen as well across the country. And lots of folks may not have been familiar with the program. It is now in full force. And again, we keep in mind that number of about 2,000 per month combined with the services in North Carolina who transition. So it is, those difficulties exist. Again, we talked about the efforts to ensure employers understand how to read military resumes, as well as helping the military who are transitioning to get that counseling to help them write their resumes and provide the information in a manner that the civilian employers are used to seeing so they can understand it and process it.
It sounds like a good transition. The Green Beret I was talking to said he compared it to going on a racetrack at 200 miles an hour, and then suddenly you got to start going the speed limit. And so the civilian life often is a lot less intense than a military life, certainly an active duty military life where you're in line of fire.
Well, you also come back to that point that I talked about earlier about transitioning of missions that we've, until this year, had been downsizing our military, putting more stress on them because of obligations around the world. And as you said, they're, as a result, going 1,000,000 miles an hour. That gave more pressure to the home life, to the domestic situation, to the career path, and to the emotional and physical health of our military, because they were under such stress for so long on a continuing basis, both active and reserve. We have North Carolina National Guard units deploying every month for 1 year rotations. Was just at a deployment ceremony about a month ago for a unit we have going to Afghanistan to do a 1 year, an aerial unit that's going to do a 1 year deployment. So we know those challenges exist, and I think the situation is getting better. But we do have to recognize the pressure that is on them and that transition, this pretty tough transition for them.
How do you balance your role? So the federal government has a lot of services to help veterans, VA hospitals, among others. What's North Carolina's role in that specifically, beyond what the federal government helps with?
Well, in our department in particular, we have 14 offices statewide for veteran service offices, we call them, to assist veterans in applying for and receiving or appealing any denials of their benefits. So whether it's their loans for housing or education or their medical treatment, et cetera, we have offices that will assist them. Approximately 92 counties also have local veteran service offices. And so we a lot of times have to make sure we contact the community and the family so they know that this infrastructure exists for them to work from to start with. The second thing for us is making sure that the federal facilities that are there are accessible. We have a service officer at each one of the federal VA centers and helping to facilitate access by veterans. A lot of them, until recently, who needed psychological counseling or had mental distress, could not qualify unless they had a good conduct discharge. Recently, a law was passed that said if you're a veteran, you get that treatment irrespective of what your discharge was, because we understand the cost to the community if we don't do that. We as a department also have 4 nursing homes that we provide skilled nursing care to veterans, approximately 125 beds or spaces per nursing home. We're going to build 2 more in the coming year that will be 150 bed units, and that will provide additional assistance for veterans in North Carolina. Finally, end-of-life care for veterans is important, that we assist in both the planning and then also from the aspect that we operate 4 cemeteries here in North Carolina for state veterans. We have a federal cemetery at Salisbury, a federal cemetery in Raleigh, one in Florence, South Carolina, that are all close to North Carolina residents, but for residents of North Carolina who qualify under the state statute, they can be buried in our cemeteries. We have 2 cemeteries that will be expanded. The one at Fort Bragg, commonly known as Sand Hills, right outside the gate at Fort Bragg, and then the one in Black Mountain, North Carolina, right outside of Asheville. So those are services that a lot of people aren't aware of, don't understand that we provide, that are state services that we use as a method of giving back. And they're operated based on the revenue of the veterans who receive those services.
Let me take a step back. It's 4th of July season, and Lieutenant General Stanley McChrystal, when he retired, could have stepped away from the arena altogether. And instead, he's decided to head up a group called the Service Year Alliance. And the point of the Service Year Alliance nationally is he's trying to get Americans to believe that they have some obligation to serve, whether it's in the military or after they finish their schooling, maybe going into a city and teaching or providing some kind of service. And you did both. You served in the military, but also you launched on a career of public service after that. What do you think would happen if North Carolina chose to be a leader in this notion of service, whether it's military or not? What would happen to our cities if we had more people who were doing that?
I think that's a great concept and a great idea, and maybe we need to emphasize more and expose more to the public. Maybe this show will help do that, that there are many people out there you may not be aware of who are working in the community, so why not you? That you could match their efforts, and maybe there's a challenge system that we do that under. You can imagine the impact it would have. I talked about the over 32,000 Reserve and National Guard members we have in North Carolina. Well, based on their culture, all of them are going to be involved some way in their community, or most of them. They'll be crossing guards or Sunday school teachers or Boy Scout or Girl Scout troop leaders or Little League football coaches, baseball coaches, or maybe even community watch leaders. But they're providing service, and when they deploy, the community has to make up for that. And so maybe there's a way to issue a challenge as well to leverage it and say, look, let's identify first that all these folks are giving community service, and now the question is, what will you do to give back to your community too? So I think it's a great idea, and I think it will make a tremendous difference in our state.
What do you think the biggest issues facing our state over the next couple of years and then maybe over the next 20 years are?
Well, we know over the next few years that one of the biggest challenges, we acknowledge those folks who are sober and realistic, that we have 2 North Carolinas. And if we don't do aggressive planning and implementation of infrastructure and access to technology, we will not be able to recruit jobs and economic development to those areas, and those areas will continue to fall further behind, get depopulated, and it will create more stress and pressure on our urban areas. So we know that's an immediate problem, an immediate challenge that we have an opportunity to pass policies every day to address. And if we don't, we're going to pay the price. That's also a long-term problem. If you look at our urban areas, the need for transportation and the graying of our state and our population say we need to have public transportation to facilitate people's movement, access to services, reduce traffic congestion, reduce air pollution, help our economy and our ecology. And so we see those 2 items as moving forward in every cycle, whether it's a budget cycle, election cycle, or just an annual year. But every time we ignore these facts, we're jeopardizing the quality of life of our future generations. That means our children. That means we're falling down on our responsibility to provide for them to have a better future than we have.
Who's someone that you've met recently that you can imagine 20 years from now is going to be doing something amazing?
I met a person who was working in public service. He was working for a organization that does research, I want to say a research, almost a think tank. He was a young man who had been in the Air Force, left the Air Force, went and got his degree under the GI Bill or under the benefits of the Air Force, and was doing research at this organization. And he was very passionate about what could he do to make a difference for the future going forward. And he was an immigrant too, and he was determined to try to find out what he could do to make a better future for his family. Now, bear in mind, in my mind, the energy and the dedication he had to lift the least of these to a better life was a good idea for me to think that if he made a way for his family and his community easier and better, then those folks above him who had more resources would have an even better chance as well. And for that spirit to continue to exist and that dedication and that fire to be there, I felt good about the fact he would be communicating those ideas and getting things done to help his family and his community.
You'll be a culture carrier.
He'll be a culture carrier.
Secretary Larry Hall, thank you for being with us. That's our show for today. Thank you for your service. We'll see you in the future.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC-TV network.